regulators have rewritten the rules for the world's banks, so they're going to have tougher requirements on capital they must hold. The idea here to guard against potential losses. So it's an attempt to restrict some of the risky activities that led to the financial crisis. Some banks are complaining, though, that borrowers' costs of credit will go higher and that lending will have to be restricted. With a little bit more on which banks are in the best shape to deal with the new world order, we bring in Dirk Hoffmann-Becking. He is a Bloomberg Best and a European bank analyst at Sanford C. Bernstein in London. Dirk, always glad to talk to you. Thanks for joining us this morning. Can you quantify how many of Europe's banks are in good enough shape to comply with the rules? I mean, is it the majority?
Yes, it's by far the majority. So if we look at the banks that we cover, we can't see one that is not likely to meet these requirements. And it's predominantly because the requirements, and in particular the transitional period, has been stretched out so far. I mean, if we look into 2019 as the target level of 7% common tier 1 equity, if you earn 12% a year through the cycle, you should be making this. There's very hard to see which banks would actually fail. And most of the larger banks that we cover are actually at the 7% target by the middle of 2013 at the latest.
So, Dirk, just trying to see it from an investor's point of view. I mean, I've seen research out there that says UK banks and Swiss banks are the best positioned because their equity ratios, you just alluded to this, are already among the highest in Europe. Do you see it that way? For an investor, are those two groups the best, the UK and the Swiss banks?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that you have to remember is the regulation is a function of how bad the banks were affected in the first place during the financial crisis. So with the Swiss banks and the UK banks suffering amongst the worst in the financial crisis, their regulators have pushed their equity levels up much earlier than they did with, for example, the French banks or the German banks. So that's why both the Swiss and the UK banks have much better capital ratios right now than some of their peers. It's not 100% like that, but broadly speaking, I think that's a fair assessment.
So, Dirk, I asked you a question as far as the investor's point of view goes. Now, from the bank's point of view, I mean, some of the banks are saying, look, borrowers' costs are going to go higher, and now we're going to have to restrict lending. Are those fair points, or are they just complaints?
Again, it's a question of implementation. If you had implementation time horizon into 2012 or 2013, I think that's an absolutely valid concern. If you have an implementation horizon into 2019, then, assuming that banks are allowed to make money along the way, they will not have to materially restrict their lending activities. And the other side of the medal is the demand for lending is much lower. We are in a deleveraging period for all economies in the developed markets. So, it's not only the supply question, it's also a demand question. So I think with the 2019 target, we are relatively safe from a credit crunch induced or credit restriction induced economic slowdown.
Dirk, thanks as always. Appreciate the insight. Dirk Hoffmann-Becking joining us there from Sanford C. Bernstein in London.